Okay, welcome to CSIS. I'm Jeff Mankoff with the Russia and Eurasia program here, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion of public opinion in the U.S. Russia relationship with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Levada Center. We talk a lot about the U.S. Russia relationship here, often from the perspective of Washington and Moscow, from the perspective of our respective political leaderships. What we seem to be missing in a lot of these discussions is a sense of how this relationship looks at the grassroots, how ordinary people think about the other country, how they think about the relationship, and how those views have changed over time. And so I'm really pleased to be presiding over our discussion here today, which I should also point out is the culmination of a collaborative effort by the Chicago Council and the Levada Center. So despite all of the vagaries in U.S.-Russian relations over the last couple of years, this is a really good example of an area where there's continued collaboration in a way that ideally will benefit both our countries and societies in terms of being better informed about how we view one another. The collaboration between these two institutions has resulted in the publication of this report here. There are copies in the back, and if you haven't grabbed one already, I would encourage you to do that. We're going to have a discussion with our panel. They're going to present some slides highlighting the key findings of their study, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. We are on the record, and I would ask everybody to turn off their cell phones and other noise-making devices. If there are no objections then, let me start by introducing our panel. To my immediate left is Denise Volkov, who's an analyst and the head of the development department at the Levada Center in Moscow. To his left is Dina Smeltz, a senior fellow on public opinion and foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. To her left is Lily Wojtowicz, a research associate at the Chicago Council. And then on the far left, physically, not necessarily politically, that joke's always funny, Stepan Goncharov, who's a senior research fellow at the Levada Center. They're going to present the slides that they've put together collaboratively as a result of this research project. They'll trade off a little bit, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So with that, Dina, do you want to get started?
Okay. Start from this side. Thank you all for coming today. We're excited to share with you the results of this 2-year project. We're deeply grateful to the Carnegie Corporation who funded this study. The project is really to identify opportunities for improved relations in the U.S. Russia bilateral relationship, and also to identify some misperceptions on both sides that contribute to current tensions. The survey in the U.S. was conducted by Ipsos Public Affairs. It's an international survey research firm. They use an address-based nationwide online panel that is representative of the population of the United States. It was conducted February 22nd to 25th, 2019, across the country. The Chicago Council has been conducting these surveys since 1974, so we have over 40 years of experience doing these surveys, and one of the key things we look at is changes over time in the results. And the Levada Center also has been conducting research for decades, and Dennis, want to tell them about the methodology?
Yes, it's hello everyone. Thank you for coming. It's our omnibus survey. It's face to face, so it's 1,600 people, and it is 18 plus. So our standard method of survey. And we use this project as an opportunity not only to go on with our study of perception of the United States, the West in general, but also to maybe deepen our understanding. And because I see it when we develop our questionnaire collaboratively, because we had a kind of a good discussions about it. It's the good way to a look at the subject from different points of view, and this I value in this project, that we try to do this from both sides, having geographically and from different sides, because it's, there are four of us who actively collaborate in this project.
We've all learned from each other. Okay. Public opinion is often affected by the media, and the media has focused on a lot of the tensions in the bilateral relationship, and we see this in both sides of public opinion. We're just talking about some key highlights. We're going to touch on some of these through these slides, and then we can expand later through a deeper discussion, and depending on what your questions are. So the Russians and Americans view the relationship as a rivalry rather than a partnership. Interestingly, though, other research that we've done shows that both sides view the American people and the Russian people more positively than negatively. So there's still some hope for the diplomatic arena, the public diplomacy arena. The Russian general public pretty much supports the international foreign policy of the government. They think it has helped increase their international profile. They support the annexation of Crimea, think it's a good thing, and have done so since 2016 was the first time you first asked about that. They support independence for parts of eastern Ukraine. And they seem to think that poor relations with the United States is just a cost of this increased prominence on the world stage and countering U.S. foreign policy. Americans, on the other hand, also consider Russia's international profile to be increasing in the world, and they are more threatened now than they were before about Russia. But it's not quite to the same existential level as a fear of international terrorism or nuclear proliferation, which are much more urgent threats. Something that's interesting on the American side is that there are real partisan differences. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat really influences your views on cooperating or limiting Russia's influence in the world, and that is new. So before this recent period of time, Republicans and Democrats both felt similarly about Russia because of domestic political issues. Now this has become a more polarized issue. And finally, there are still some areas of shared concerns, especially in working toward common policies or common ways to address terrorism and nuclear proliferation. This is highlighted by some of the research we've done on views of the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, where many on both sides oppose their country's withdrawal from that agreement. So those are the highlights.
Sure. So one of the questions we asked both Russians and Americans was whether or not they perceived relations with their country and other countries as more of a partnership, or if they were more rivals. So you can see that both Russians and Americans largely see the United States and Russia as more rivals than partners. And Americans view the relationship with the European Union as more of a partnership. Interestingly, we found from the American perspective this year that Americans are even more likely to say China is more of a rival than a partner than they have been in the past. Stepan, do you want to do the?
Well, yeah, but we should mention, I think, that, of course, Russia and China seems like partners for majority of Russians. But this feeling is based rather on what they see in media, TV. So speaking about culture, for example, of China, or any other aspects of this cooperation, Russians are not very well informed. So when they say that Russia and China are partners, it's more, this view is formed by current deterioration of relations with the West.
Yeah. And I may add here that before this conflict with the West started, there were more concerns in Russian public opinion towards China because it's too big. Russia is comparatively small, certainly smaller than China. And, but we have this Russia and China relations in some other issues, and I think why it is appealing for Russians, because when the conflict began, many and still people feel in isolation, and when Xi Jinping, for example, came to Victory Parade, when no other major leaders from the West came, it was rather satisfying. And also it depends on how Russia's view the rising role of China. We have it a little bit further, and here I would like only to mention this rather positive view of Germany, that you see that it's mostly partners. It's still, it is new in the sense that when the conflict broke out, we saw very negative feelings towards European Union in general, but also towards Germany, France, and other European countries. And this means this survey that we've done, just done in March, it seems that some we saw some developments, that the conflict was on its height, I think, in 14-15, and now we see that public opinion warming towards certain countries because of much positive, well, some positive views about this Russian-German gas project, and some dialogue going on with Merkel and Putin. So Russian public opinion, no Merkel. At least people can understand who she is, and that's, I think, interesting.
And I think another point about the views toward China being a partner to Russia is also that while the United States has sanctioned Russia, we've also placed tariffs against China, so we've sort of pushed them together in the same mindset. One other thing I wanted to mention, it's a little bit of a different question, but we also asked in both countries whether the unity among NATO allies has grown further together, further apart, or about the same, and both Americans and Russians sense that there's been a real rift between Europeans and the United States as well. So it's interesting to pick up all these different currents among the public opinion that we see in the news media as well. So we asked this a few times in a couple of the years, whether the United States should try to undertake friendly cooperation and engagement with Russia, or whether it should actively work to limit Russia's power. And in this last survey, 55% of Americans said we should try to contain Russia rather than actively work with Russia. It's the Republicans who are more likely to say that we should try to be friendly with Russia, which has been a shift from previous surveys. And on the Russian side, it's very similar views, that 53% of Russians believe that Russia should try to limit the United States' power, and only 38% think that we should undertake engagement and cooperation.
And for me, it was striking that on several questions that we asked in this wave and the previous wave, that two countries are so similar on evaluating each other and the situation. So a very different context, very different media, because we mentioned at the very beginning that media shapes public opinion very much, but and of course we have different opinions and different different channels in the United States, and not so in Russia, where the state dominates the media landscape with the state TV channels, so dominates the agenda. And still we have this rather similar views, and for me it was one of the surprises of our mutual project.
So this is what I had mentioned earlier, that in past surveys when we asked this question, Americans generally want to cooperate with most countries, even with groups like even what they'd consider violent groups like Hamas or the Taliban, Iran, and back in the day Cuba. Americans always preferred to talk rather than disregard other countries. So it's interesting that this is really a big shift for Americans in 2016. 56% thought that we should be friendly toward Russia, and now that has reversed with a majority saying that we should contain them.
And I would just add too, so in 2016 we asked just before the 2016 presidential election, so that was July. And then we asked the question again December 2017, and we really captured this visceral reaction to the election results, particularly amongst Democrats. So they were far more likely to say that we should undertake friendly cooperation and engagement with Russia before the 2016 election, and then they were really the drivers behind this flip in sentiment towards working to limit Russia's power in 2017.
And what about Russia? It's a quite stable figure, 53% which want to contain, and in 2017 it was the same number, so it didn't change since last year.
And actually, in studying public opinion towards the United States, we have different trends, which sometimes can be rather opposite towards each other, because at the same time we will have the majority who will say that still the cooperation is needed. So cooperation and containment. And at the same time, cooperation and not giving in. Just doing what you are doing. So, but here we see kind of a problem that if you want cooperation, you have to make some first steps. But the public opinion is against any first steps towards the United States. So it's kind of what we have. We're in a deadlock in a sense. That, we want cooperation, what containment. Both at the same time and without any concessions. So it doesn't work this way.
And we've asked in past surveys too whether Russians and Americans would like to cooperate on certain issues like climate change or nuclear proliferation, and they majority say yes, we should cooperate, but they have in mind their own country's version of what they should cooperate on, like their own country's policy. So it's not necessarily an agreement. So I think one of the very interesting findings for us when looking at public opinion over the last couple of years in Russia in particular has been this increased sense of confidence, would you say, in Russians regaining their status as a global player. In this graph, you see that, I can't see the number right there, but a majority, I believe, 56% of Russians say that Russia has increased its role. It's more important now than it was 10 years ago. Americans also tend to think that Russia is more important now than 10 years ago. And for Americans, they tend to think our country is less important than it was 10 years ago, and that Russia is also more important. So I think this reflects the fact that it's now a more multipolar world. It's not so much that the U.S. is the only player calling the shots, and Russians realize that, and also because of the international policy of Russian government and Putin, they have made their mark again on the world stage.
Also, we can add here that if we ask about the greatest countries, well, the superpowers of today's world, in Russian public opinion, there are three. It's Russia, China, and United States. So Russia being the most important, of course. And this is the change from at the beginning of 90s, where there was no China. And China, there is understanding not only in Russia, I feel, yes, in the whole world of the growing of China and the growing importance of it. And speaking of this feeling that United States is losing it a little bit, still we must say that it is still considered, no question about, as a superpower in Russia as well. But I think there is a very dangerous moment of this feeling that United States is in decline, because it's in public opinion, but I would say it's also in the elite opinion, and maybe public opinion here is a reflection of this elite opinion translated through, in a sense, through the media, that in this situation when they say that United States is losing its strength, it's maybe a good context to act more actively, I might say so. And at the same time, though we have in the public opinion this that Russia is great again, yes, from the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this is what Crimea, annexation of Crimea, and the feeling around it was about. But still, there is also the underlying feeling that Russia is weak, and maybe it's also dangerous because maybe it's the right time to do something right now when we are still strong. So it's maybe a very tricky moment. So it's very, in a sense, a little bit dangerous situation.
And the context of this question is its role as important, more important, less important than it was 10 years ago? So that's also putting the United States, a majority do say it's either as important. In Russia, a majority say it's as important or more important than it was before, but a third do say less important. So yeah, it's interesting context and world dynamics.
We also asked a question not only about how overall importance or how overall influential are the countries, but also about military powers. And for Russia, for Russians, Russia seems like one of the leading military superpower, and Russian importance and Russian influence in the world is based rather on military than on economical success. And this feeling is given by media, of course, but it also can be shown, it can be seen in how President Vladimir Putin, how he express, how he appears in the public, what he says during his speeches. He always stress importance of military strengthening rather than on economical issues, but maybe not about this year speech when he is focused also on social issues. But yes, and Russians think that greatest successes of past years of Russia, they are connected with strengthening military forces, of course.
So we also asked Americans, both this year and in 2017, from a list of the countries you'll see on this figure, which one poses the greatest security threat to the United States. Interestingly, in 2017, 59% said that was North Korea. This was in the aftermath of the back and forth tweeting between their and our leader. And so we really think that's a reflection of the tension at that moment. But cut to 2 years later, and the threat perception of North Korea decreased significantly, and that of Russia rose, particularly, again, amongst Democrats. Republicans were actually more likely to say that China poses the biggest threat to U.S. security. Yeah, and so another interesting uptick that we've seen recently is the threat that Russia's territorial ambition poses to U.S. interests. And we've seen this year, or last year, the highest percentage that feel that it's played a critical threat to U.S. interests than even 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea.
So one of the big questions is, in today's events in the United States, whether people believe that Russia tried to influence the 2016 election. So the blue bar represents the overall American public, so 2/3 of Americans believe what the intelligence agencies have found in the U.S. that Russia has tried to influence the election. You see 90% of Democrats, but only 35% of Republicans believe this. This was February 2019, so before the Mueller report came out, or that hasn't come out, but the summary of the report came out. So Republicans still 6 in 10 don't think that they have tried to influence it very much. And in Russia,
in Russia, we know that the situation is not that straightforward that in this slide, because if you ask directly, you see the majority will say, well, no, more or less no. And when you ask this on focus groups, people tend to say officially no. And all these questions about any Russian possible interference around the world, it's the question we ask about the Skripal poisoning or Russian troops in eastern Ukraine or in Crimea before it was announced on TV. The majority say no, no way, we are not responsible. But in focus groups, when we persisted, more people were saying that, well, everything is possible, and probably yes, that Russia interfered, and it was, and more so, that it's the right thing to do because everybody does this. So this is, I think, here is the context of considering Russia a superpower, and superpower is about meddling in other countries' business, and also about the conflict, that it's conflict, Russia and U.S. conflict, and so this is the right thing to do. The bad thing is not interfering, but being caught. Interfered, and this is what people don't like. So, but if you ask directly, the picture will be no interference, and some people would argue that it's about fear, that Russians fear to give you the right answer. Actually, what we find from focus groups is not that they fear, but they try to. It's being, well, maybe patriotic, if I may say so. So being on the right side, but not because you fear to be caught by a government, but not losing your face and stuff like that. So it's different rationale here, but not fear.
we also did a short study of looking at Denis and Stepan conducted in-depth interviews among experts on the U.S. Russia relationship in Russia, and we did an online poll of experts on the U.S. Russia relationship here. I think Jeff actually participated in that poll, and there were some interesting findings on that too that I think it echoes what you just said, that some of the elites, it was really mixed whether people believed that Moscow did interfere in the elections or not. But even those who didn't believe it said if they did, then they shouldn't have been caught. They should have done it in a more intelligent way. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we asked about the impact of this of active, adventurous Russian policy, and what we see interesting for me. The interesting thing is that there is understanding that it cost. It had it cost. And I would say that, and you can see it in this slide, and we have through different other surveys, the growing feeling that it costs more and more, that with the economic crisis, but also with the pension reform being introduced last year, more and more people are starting asking question whether it is worth doing. But at the same time, and this is, I think, one of the important results of our project, that at the same time we see that people like Russia's active role in the world, and still we have in our somewhere in our slide the majority of saying that it is right thing to do, and that people approve of Russia's active role, but at the same time questioning whether it's worth doing. Again, very contradicting trends in public opinion, and maybe one of the explanations why we have so many contradicting trends. It is the result of not many people publicly putting these things together, because on Russia media you can hear how is it apology of the Russian foreign policy, and not many people speaking publicly about the costs, but still people feel costs in everyday life, and not privately, on focus groups, for example, we hear more and more people questioning this, but it's not result in public opposition towards this policy, partly because there is no public opposition at all. I mean, no opposition in public, and those who express opposition, they're compromised or discredited by Russian TV, and there is no credible and trustful faces in public sphere that can express this criticism and put two and two together. So this is the problem.
I think just an interesting point too is that you saw the slide previously that showed 8 in 10 Russians think that Russia is a rising military power, and that here you see partially they see that as connecting to the foreign policy.
And one more point, that when we ask about Russian active international policy in general, it's maybe slightly different if we ask about exact actions. For example, military operation in Syria is not such popular as support of Eastern Part rebels in Ukraine. So it depends on the context of the question and what we're asking about.
Two more things that I just found really interesting about this question in particular. So we kind of talked a little bit about how Russians see the negative impacts on the economy and standards of living, but they're also registering, the large majority say that it's worsened Russia's relationship with the United States. But if you look at Levada polling on a whole on sort of the U.S. reaction to Russian foreign policy, I get the sense that Russians, they don't care that it's impacted the relationship with the United States. You know, I mean, Levada has this great question too on whether or not they should adjust policy because of sanctions, or if they should just continue acting in their own interest. And largely, Russians think that their country should act in their own interest, regardless of sort of the West's reaction. The other thing that I find interesting is that, you know, the majority sees Russia's foreign policy in recent years as a benefit to its international influence. I think that that's a reflection of their hard power capabilities, but they're more split on Russia's international image. You know, the plurality, 44%, say that it's improved, but 42% say that it's worsened. I think that's more of a reaction to the sort of, so that some people see a degradation in Russia's soft power ability.
Okay, and this is about Crimea, more bad, or more harm or more good, and we must also put it in a dynamic, and we see that, and this is actually the question where there is some changes, because when we ask about whether should Crimea be part of Russia or not, it's, well, no changes. Majority say it's part of Russia, no question. But with this crisis, economic crisis, tightening sanctions, and, well, poor economic performance, with pension reform, which is understood as ordinary Russian paying for, so state do not have enough money for pensions, partly because it spends, the state spends it for Crimea, for Syria, for everyone else around the world, not for ordinary Russians. So it, in this context, on this question, we saw a growing number of people that say that maybe it was not a good thing to do after all. I mean, taking Crimea. And we see that it's, there is a divide in U.S. public opinion, Democrats and Republicans. Here we have pro-Putin, against Putin. So those who do not approve of Putin, they say the more harm. So they tend to see it as a more harmful action, partly, I think, because we must understand that opposition towards Putin, the majority of this opposition is not liberal-minded intellectuals, but people who suffered economically. It's more of those who do not have enough money for daily stuff, so who are in need, and for them it's more a more pressing problem that Russia is spending resources outside the country and not spending it inside the country.
What is the percentage of approve of Putin versus do not approve of Putin overall in Russia?
Overall, it's 64% for three months.
That support.
Approve
of his performance.
Yeah. But speaking of approval, it's not only about Putin, it's more about status quo. If we ask about Putin, I would rather use trust in Putin or electoral rating of Putin, which is more closer to his supporters. But much of these big numbers in approval, in trust, in electoral ratings come from this feeling of no alternative that we already touched a little bit. So no approval, no alternative. If 2 years ago, many in the focus groups, people were giving explanations why they approve or why they trust Putin, because he made Russia great and noticeable in international arena, that everybody is taking notice of Russia. Now there's not that much rationale, and many people say, well, you know, no one else. So 2 years ago, positive explanations, now not so positive explanations.
So for Americans and how they view our actions taken in response to Russian interference in the elections and to the annexation of Crimea, we asked whether U.S. actions to date to isolate Russia have gone too far, are about right, or not gone far enough. And overall, the light blue bar, you see it's a little bit divided. 49% of Americans say that it's been about right, and that includes 71% of Republicans. And then 49% of Democrats say that they have not gone far enough, and overall that's 36%. So it's another split between Republicans and Democrats that isn't necessarily tied so much to their actual awareness of what's in the sanctions and the underlying reasons why they're there, but more about political preferences and the legitimacy of Donald Trump, which goes at the heart of all these questions about interference in the election. It's really would be a strike against the legitimacy of his presidency if the Republicans agreed that that happened. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we also asked, this was in 2017, various takes on the sanctions that the West has placed on Russia. So for Americans, we asked them what modifications to Russian behavior, they thought would be most important and second most important to sort of elicit a easing of sanctions. And interestingly, you'll see, towards the bottom, returning Crimea to Ukraine, which is sort of the original source of these, is a fairly low priority for Americans. They're far more interested in some sort of agreement to refrain from using cyber tactics on other countries. And then the second most significant to Americans was withdrawing support for Assad in Syria. Again, it's the priority on Ukraine and Crimea is much less significant than these other, aspects of Russia's policy. And
then as for Russian opinion, signing document that will limit interference, cyber attacks, is not very sensitive for Russian, but very sensitive for Americans. And this makes a common ground for a deal. And at the same time, reunification with Crimea has very much support, and that's why vast majority of Russians won't accept any deal with it.
Can you go back one? I think an interesting thing is ceasing airstrikes in Syria. So 40% would oppose it, 35% would support it. I think it's interesting that there is some common perception among Americans and Russians on the issue of Syria, where neither necessarily wants to get super involved in the domestic dispute. It's more about combating international terrorism, which has been a common goal for Russia for a long, long time. And so Americans too, they want to support crushing ISIS, but not necessarily helping the rebel forces in Syria. So.
Yeah, speaking about Syria, maybe to place it in the context, as Stepan was already saying, that it's not a big priority for public opinion, and actually a half of population, a little bit more now, in favor of ending any activities in Syria, and the government understands that and tries to limit any kind of information. First of all, negative information from Syria, and also announcing for 3 times, I think, already that Russia is going out of Syria. So 3 times already it was done, and so it's the problem for public opinion is that it's do not see definite good explanations why Russia is in Syria. Big explanation is because it's countering not terrorism but U.S. influence in this region. But still, the majority don't know where Syria is exactly. And from the very beginning, and for me it was very interesting that even without asking a direct question, we got the references to Afghanistan. But many in Russia feared and still fear that Syria will be the second Afghanistan, in a sense of just deepening this war and Russia being just drawn into it and so on. So and that's why with Syria can be some common ground, but as some our other questions from this survey and previous survey showed that it's more about countering terrorism and also having an agreement on nuclear weapons, which is we have majority on both in both countries. And with the INF Treaty, it's interesting that there are still big portions in society still agree on and approve of what government is doing and saying, that maybe current agreement is outdated, that is bad. But still, the majority say that some agreement is needed because it's a big problem, because it's about nuclear, and still people feel that this is not a game to play. That some agreement is needed.
So just a general observation is that given that there aren't very strong institutional ties between Russia and the United States, especially now that we've withdrawn from some of these agreements, the relationship between American presidents has been really what's driven U.S. Russia policy forward in positive ways. And in the current American context, with the investigations into Trump administration's ties to Russia, and with Congress's strong hand on whether Trump can even maneuver in trying to relieve some of the sanctions, really in this particular moment, the role of the president's interactions is pretty irrelevant to today's situation. So it's interesting to note that in contrast to past administrations. And in terms of public opinion, as you saw in the last few slides, the Americans and Russians don't really seem to have much room to negotiate, especially on issues of Crimea. There, at the same time, is no domestic pressure in either country to change the current tense environment. And then there are some interesting internal differences in each country, with Republicans being more willing to cooperate with Russia than Democrats, and in those people who support Putin, who don't support Putin, having some differences on Crimea. But generally, majorities toward each country see each other as a rival, and that their influence and power should be maintained. So it's not, even though we have endeavored to be a peaceful cooperation and move toward improvement, it is a pretty depressing reality of where things stand today.
Okay, well, on that cheery note, I'm going to open it up to questions. We have a little bit more than half an hour, but let me just start with a couple of I guess, brief observations and then maybe things to kick off the discussion. To start with the last point there, I think one of the challenges in the U.S. Russia relationship has long been this lack of what, for a better term, we might call ballast. That is, lack of stakeholders on either side in the relationship. People who benefit or have a personal stake in some way from having a better relationship at the political level. And so consequently, political ties have always been subject to pretty dramatic swings based on things that happen, whether it's a crisis or an invasion or something else. And that doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon. Now that's both good and bad. The good aspect of it is that the relationship is subject to changing with the political winds. I remember during the Obama-Medvedev reset, one of the figures that we in the US like to cite a lot was that Russian perceptions of the United States had improved dramatically over the course of just a couple of years because of the greater emphasis that was being placed on cooperation. And of course, now we are where we are. So on the one hand, you don't have this kind of grassroots pressure on either side to get out of the current conflictual dynamic. On the other hand, if there's some kind of deus ex machina that does shift the political dynamic, public opinion can follow relatively quickly. And I think that's true on both the US and on the Russian sides. As far as the survey goes, it's a really interesting initiative, and I'd love to hear more about how your two institutions are able to work together on this project despite the various challenges that the U.S.-Russia relationship has right now. But since you've been doing this work now for a couple of years, what are some of the biggest surprises you've noticed in terms of how things have changed over time? Or what were some of the results from your 2019 survey that maybe you didn't expect based on the work that you'd done over the course of previous surveys?
I think for the most part, because this was just a 2-year project, and opinions on foreign policy in the United States, at least, do not change super quickly. I don't think that the shifts were as interesting as what Dennis said, some of the parallel views. So there's a slide, the question about containing and limiting, yeah, that was it actually. Yep. Was nearly identical. This question too about Americans and Russians both wanting an active part in world affairs, that was really nearly identical as well. So it's interesting, the mindsets are similar despite being on the opposite sides on a lot of issues. And a lot of this it's Russians and Americans don't know that much about the other country. We've done another survey that very few Russians have ever met an American, and some Americans have met, like 20% of Americans have met a Russian who was here either working or had moved here. So I think there's a lot that could be, and still there's a sense of soft power on both sides that both Americans and Russians view the other country as being highly successful in science and technology in particular. And so I think the data do show some opportunities. But I think most of the time, views on foreign policy tend to be stable. There is one other interesting shift of I think it's at the end, of Russia's views of the U.S., and that when Donald Trump did get elected, there was wasn't there a shift upward, I believe? It's at the very end. So you see there was a spike, and
in 2016?
Yeah, in 2016. And so that, and what was the Helsinki summit, when, again. So I think, Trump actually, there were really high expectations in Russia when he did win. And so it's been another disappointment for them.
Yeah.
So that was one of the more volatile points.
And that's actually a question too that we don't have a figure for, but we asked Russians. Well, Levada has a trend on whether or not they think the relationship will change based on who is president of the United States, and Russians were largely hopeful that relations would improve, and then after about a year of Trump being in office, we asked if they thought the relationship had changed, and we saw that no, they were quite disappointed.
Yeah, but here I can also add that yes, there were rather high expectations, but I would say the government has had more expectations than the general public, because the expectations were a little bit more than expectations of Obama's first term as president. And in focus groups, I liked it because people were talking about it and said, yes, well, all these politicians, they promise golden mountains at the very beginning, and then it comes out to nothing. So it's like...
As Chernobyl said, we wanted the best, turned out the way it always does.
Yeah, so it's in this sense, there were expectations, but people thought that maybe it will be like with all politicians. And trying to figure out the formula for U.S.-Russian relations, I would say that, again, many people in focus groups were telling that, well, we will never be friends. Never. But it does not mean that we can't live peacefully together. So it's more kind of a coexistence without interfering into each other's business. This formula can be very popular, I would say, with public opinion, because yes, we see this dynamic of Russians' attitudes towards the United States, and yes, it's very dynamic and very much maybe dependent on the current agenda, political agenda, generated by politicians and media. But still, there is, if you look at the overall estimates of U.S. role in the world, it's pretty negative since the end of 90s. So, and this is the basis for this conflict.
And,
Okay, I have.
Sorry, I was just going to say yes. In the research that we did among the experts, even in the United States, many experts were reflecting on some of the agenda items that the U.S. had, like NATO expansion, the Kosovo War, the sanctions, just many different steps along the way that have just aggravated the relationship.
And these are actually these blows in these dips of the attitudes. It's first it's Kosovo, then it's Iraq of 2003, then it's Russian-Georgian war, then it's annexation of Crimea.
Almost to the month, too, because you guys ask this so
Yeah,
frequently.
so
Yeah.
Okay, I have lots more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience. So the first hand I saw was Ariel. So please wait for the microphone, and when you get it, identify yourself and then actually ask a question. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. It is really a dispiriting exercise to look at your data and analyze the decline of popularity of the United States and Russia and the United States. But I want to ask a question a little bit different, in a different way. To what extent do you think having a great power opponent is conducive for maintaining your own power in one's country? And I'm not singling out any country here. But having an enemy that is big and scary, and you can wave the flag and mobilize a lot of resources and make a lot of people rich by having that enemy and keep yourself in power for the foreseeable future. To what extent do you think that is playing into this equation? Thank you.
So we don't have data to sort of quantify this, but I know from more anecdotally, in the U.S., I certainly got the sense that very many people were, in a sort of perverse way, thrilled to have Russia back as the enemy. You know, I mean, it's just this sentiment towards Russia just snapped right back in terms of how we talk about Russia in the media, in particular. And I've rather gotten the sense too that it's the same way in Russia, that Putin benefits from having the United States as, you know, as an enemy.
Yeah, we can add that if we see Putin's approval ratings, we can see that in the points where we see dips in attitude to the US, we will see spikes in attitude to Putin in approval of his action. Because, of course, when you're in the situation of confrontation with a powerful enemy, you need a strong leader, a strong hero to save you. That's why you need a strong authoritarian leader, as Putin is.
At the same time, it's not a Cold War scenario where there's two ideologies combating each other. And also, Americans, they're more likely to see Russia as a threat now, but it's like a grade B threat. It's not up to the same level as a lot more pressing, urgent matters. And at the same time, you know, 2002 was the first time we did a survey after September 11th. And that was a point where the public was so mobilized to take action on everything, the American public. But then, after the war in Iraq, after several years in Afghanistan, with a sustained effort, so much blood and treasure spent, they weren't able, the government wasn't able to maintain that support. So yes, it might work for a while, but if the public does not see any success, and if it's not done within a reasonable amount of time and at a low cost, then the public will tend to turn.
Yes, and it's short term, but I would also say that it's maybe not the most important instrument of maintaining Putin's popularity. It's more important is this feeling of no alternative, and I would say that this conflict and having an enemy helps, for example, to discredit your opponents, that they are bought by the West. So it's not exactly to mobilize, but just help to to explain your actions in Syria, for example. Because if there is no United States, maybe it's harder to explain why are you going there. So it's kind of a handy tool of making it more manageable, but not the main point, main instrument of boosting support of the regime.
Okay, Andrei.
Andrei Lorenov, Kate Institute. First of all, with your permission, Dina, could I challenge your assessment, your results of your report, as depressing? It seems to me it's pretty positive and rather optimistic, because if you would come to result that American public opinion is eager to cooperate with Mr. Putin in support of Mr. Bashar Assad or Nicolas Maduro, or North Korean leader, or in annexation of Crimea, it would be much more depressing. So that is why it's kind of some ray of hope in this side. Two questions, one for Dina and Lily, one for Denis and Stepan. For Dina and Lily, again, how would you describe such a huge discrepancies between Republicans and Democrats in viewing Russia, which you would not see in any other areas of politics and policies in the United States? And for Denis and Stepan, you have not seen, you have not shown here these numbers, but you definitely know from a result of your center, this famous ratio, some kind of 65 or 64, 84 to 16 or 86 to 14 in support of Crimea annexation and against, kind of back in the year 2014, kind of support of Putin. Now it's slightly different, but doesn't matter. But if we come to such events like who killed or who tried to poison Skripal, those Russians who think that it was Russian security service, it's about 3%. Those Russians who think who hit MH17, It is 1%. All others would be Ukrainians, Americans, British, foreign Asians, and so on. How would you describe this unthinkable low percentage of Russians about these events like MH17, Skripal poisoning, and similar, even much smaller than Crimea annexation? Why so small portion of Russians thinks in such way?
Okay. So do you want to start with
Sure.
that?
Well, I'd like to challenge your assertion back that since the Iraq War, there have been growing divisions between Republicans and Democrats on foreign policy, not just on Russia, which I would argue is more a reflection of domestic politics than actually foreign policy, but we see huge divides on immigration, on climate change between Republicans and Democrats. I'm trying to think of some of the other issues that we have. Defense spending, a lot of, it used to be that the water, differences stopped at the water's edge to some extent before the Iraq War, but since then there have been really big differences.
Yeah. Can I stop it? So on Russia in particular, so we have a similar question to Levada. We ask on a temperature rating how Americans feel about an individual country. And since 1982, we've been asking first about the Soviet Union and then Russia. And Russia is an interesting case right now because, you know, Americans used to be fairly cohesive on how they viewed Moscow. It wasn't until after the election in 2016 that we saw this split. And interestingly enough, I mean, you think about Republicans typically as being hawkish on Russia and the Soviet Union. We saw Republican opinion of Russia improve between 2017 and 2018, whereas Democrat opinion has deteriorated. It's a very interesting case, and I think it really is a reflection of rallying support behind the president. We've asked this in this particular survey. There were very few questions where there wasn't a partisan difference. So the one most notable was on arms control. We asked whether Americans and Russians would favor coming to an agreement to limit nuclear weapons. So in the United States, 90% of Republicans favored coming to an agreement, and 89% of Democrats also favored coming to an agreement. And that was really it in terms of cohesion from Americans across parties. And this one, we asked a series of questions on Russia and Syria in 2018. And we found that on this very niche issue, right, Russia's involvement in Syria, there was a lot of cohesion between Democrats and Republicans and sort of foreign policy. So if you take Trump out of the equation, which is hard to do sometimes, you do find that they're united. But as soon as there's even a hint at Trump, we see these gaps in Democrats and Republicans.
I think the gaps were all about the election interference. Because sanctions, there weren't very big differences. It's all because of the fact, because Democrats will tend to say if Russia interfered, then Trump was, this is the thinking in people's heads, that if the elections had been tampered with, then Trump was illegitimately elected. So that's really what the impetus is. It's a support for Trump. And some 80-something percent of Republicans now have a positive opinion of Trump. So it's become a partisan debate. So on the broader foreign policy issues there regarding Russia, it's not as great a divide. But yeah, basically, as I said at the outset, it really is a reflection of domestic politics.
Okay, further questions over here. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to let you guys answer the question about why Russian views of things like the Skripal poisoning are.
Well, it depends on the question. If we ask yes or no, the answer will be no involvement. If we ask who actually poisoned. That the most popular answer is 55, 53, could be anyone. And it means when we ask it on focus groups that there are actually much more people willing to admit Russia's involvement and that Russia is responsible. But they choose in the open question and in front question they choose not to answer. So because it's kind of a unpatriotic and like this.
Okay, so over here. Front row.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist. It's clear in the American respondents, there's a partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats. In the Russian respondents, one of you, when you were talking about the Crimea question, talked about a divide between those who had and had not benefited from Putin's policies. Is that, or is there another consistent divide in the Russian answers that comparable to the partisan divide in Americans? Thanks.
I'll pull up this area.
And also the
Well, there is one group is pro-Putin, anti-Putin, but also other prominent groups with differences in evaluation of Putin's policy. For example, it's the audiences of independent media versus mainstream media. There you can find some differences. There will be not cardinal, but still there's some differences in this, whether people are following independent news regularly or not. And whether another group, it's again, the criticism of Putin is situated in two groups, we must say, those who follow independent media and those who are not well off, but just bad
What
off.
about Leningrad and Moscow versus the rural areas?
St. Petersburg.
Sorry?
Leningrad and Moscow on one hand and the provinces.
Well, there is some differences, but not very big.
Generation.
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing we were talking about before that would be interesting to tease out a little bit is the generational divide.
Young Russians, which are under 25 years old, they also have more favorable view of the U.S. and they traditionally are for cooperation and slightly more for cooperation with the U.S. than other age groups. And yes, and what about questions about Ukraine, Crimea? Yes, it seems like they have maybe less in this ideological frame. Maybe they're kind of more they're not very interested in politics at all, and such issues like about Crimea or eastern part of Ukraine, they're not very interested in, and they prefer to stay on the official line like this.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I'll get you next.
Howard Steers, sometime Consul General in Yekaterinburg in the Lubika. One other category that you may not have asked about, but just if you have a feel, is there a split between non-believers and believers? Crimea was a great step forward for the Orthodox Church. The actions of the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople was a great setback. And at least out in the Lubinka, this had considerable influence when I was there. Thank you.
Well, if I understood right, that the question right, that of course there are different views, and it depends on the question, because well, Crimea is there is more consensus about it, about the status of Crimea. But if you look at the different questions like Syria is already big portions of population just don't know what how to relate to this, and it depends on the issue. It's not that Russian opinion is always supportive of the state policy, and actually because of this, Russia has to invest much in propaganda, in state propaganda, because even with Ukraine, we had before the conflict, the majority was against any Russia's involvement. They say no troops, no money, just let them be, and what they want is another country, just stay out of it. And Russia has to actually, what we saw, it's the change of how the news were delivered. It's kind of a war state mode of operation of the media. So they had to convince the people that Russia has to get involved, and they done so in huge, massive propaganda programs, and also using these issues of threat to the Russian-speaking population, comparing Ukrainian government with Nazis and so on. So just to convince people that is right thing for Russia to intervene.
He was asking about religious divides and whether there are certain questions where there's a difference between people who identify as being Orthodox believers and those who don't, or maybe between Orthodox and Muslims.
Well,
I think
Muslims
there are
5%.
Yeah, it's very hard to say, because we don't have enough subgroups in our sample of people with different religious views.
Yes,
But I don't think that there are much difference between them.
Maybe there should be differences in big believers and.
Right, that's what his question was.
Yeah, but for me it's hard to say.
There certainly was a difference with the Orthodox hierarchy that I was familiar with, and they kind of led what was said in every church in Russia on Sundays. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oleg Merkulov, West LV Media Group from Riga, Latvia. In your surveys, do you take into account the opinion of millions of Russians who found themselves living in independent states after the breakup of the Soviet Union? For instance, in Latvia, in Estonia combined maybe 1 million, right? But who still affiliated emotionally, culturally with Russia? And if so, how does their opinion differs from the opinion of Russians living in Russia proper? Thank you.
No, we usually deal with Russia only. It's, do not have many projects in these countries, almost nothing.
No.
Yeah, there are research organizations, though, in the Baltics that do studies, and I'm sure they break it down by the different nationalities.
Okay, back there.
Thank you. Maria Snegovaya, Center for European Policy Analysis. I wonder if you measured the data in dynamic, specifically the concessions that Russians are ready to in order to lift the sanctions. Can you tell us anything about the dynamic, the change starting in 2014? Thank you.
About concessions, I think that we don't have.
No, it was actually the result of this project that we were looking at these questions, and actually our colleagues helped us to think about it this way. So
We can
So
have
we
a
don't
trend.
have
Do you want to go back to that slide?
I think she wanted to see a trend.
Oh, yeah, we only had, again, because it was just really a 2-year framework, we didn't expect things to shift that much, especially since the view on Crimea has been super stable.
yeah, right now there's no much dynamics in the question whether Russia should give in or not. It's rather stable that Russia should not make concessions. The majority thinks so. So,
Jeff, is it even clear what exactly the concessions would have to be?
To get the sanctions lifted?
Yeah, I mean, would they have to tick off each?
Yeah, well, I think others may have different views on this, but I think the U.S. policy has been somewhat muddled on this issue because there have been different rounds of sanctions in response to different activities, and some of them are linked to specific policy choices, for example, getting out of Crimea or implementing the Minsk agreement. Others aren't. They're in response to things that have happened in the past, and the U.S. is using them as a way to impose costs or send a message. And to my mind, it's less clear what the pathway towards removing those kind of sanctions would be. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alexandria Wills. I'm here in personal capacity. So in regard to your, I guess, conclusion that that Americans and Russians see each other as rivals that need to be contained, what do you think would need to happen either organically or by putting in some work on either side that could sort of change that mentality of both Americans and or Russians?
I'll start. Well, as I said early on, the piece of positive news is that among the publics, there is still some goodwill to work on. So a lot of diplomatic exchanges and exchanges of experts, which had happened a lot in previous decades. That's really where things should start, so that maybe there would be some grassroots feelings or pressure to improve things. But one area of potential, as I said before, was working on arms control. So even though we withdrew from the INF treaty, both publics, many think that it was a mistake to do so. And this is one area where we had working level experts having a dialogue all the time on these types of issues. And we're still having some dialogue on deconflicting in Syria, for example. So I think having expert communities still maintaining the dialogue and waiting until there's a better time when the United States domestic political situation is less intense in a partisan way, that maybe we could pick up and build on that. But I think I used to work for the State Department in the public diplomacy arm, and I think there's a great role. That's how we met, actually. Stepan and my team had met as part of an exchange program, not the State Department, but a different exchange program. But those kinds of interactions are really important, especially in this environment now.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sarah Oates, a professor at University of Maryland and a Wilson Fellow this year. Thanks for a fascinating presentation, a lot of really important information. I have a question, but I also have a point to your question. So I've been teaching Russian media and politics for 25 years, and I've never been more popular. So I think the good news, not just for me maybe, is that my students, my undergraduate students, much more interested. I think more people are interested in learning Russian. So I think if there's a silver lining, it's there. My question to you is, of course, because I study the media, when, to a hammer, everything's a nail. Did you ask anything about media use, particularly of the Russians? Because I think that's...
Well, we, not in this project, but we will publish soon. Well, we monitor the usage of different media. We see, actually we do it with Stepan together for a couple of years. And another round will be in a month or so. There will be new data on how TV is going down, internet going up. Yeah.
Right, and I stalk you guys online. In fact, you did my dissertation research 25 years ago. But the other point I want to make quickly was media might be an intervening variable for some of the American, the difference in opinions, because we know not all Republicans support Trump, but almost all Trump supporters are Republicans. So, and we know that Trump supporters tend to live in a media bubble and are much fonder of particular media outlets such as Fox News and Breitbart. And there's been really good research on that. So I'm wondering if the coverage of Russia is really different on those outlets in some way that might be driving these changes. But that's a research project for me, maybe for you.
It may not have changed that much necessarily on those outlets, but on the left-leaning outlets, it has become more negative and more prominent.
I hadn't even thought, that's a really good
Yeah.
point.
Okay. We have got time for maybe 2 more questions. So let's go up here and then in the back. Let's up here.
Hi, thank you very much. Fascinating conversation. Irina Zaslavsky, I did work with IFS on surveys a lot, so apologize for methodological question. Since you did parallel in 2 countries such a exquisite survey, how much you controlled for exact language to be the questionnaire, following each other, open-ended, closed-ended questions and things like that. So how comparative, I know the gentleman from Levada did trends. I don't know if you had trends, this kind of question. Thank you very much again.
Sure. So we started out with sort of topics that we wanted to cover, and sometimes we started with one of our trends, sometimes we started with one of Levada's trends, and we generally had to adjust some of the language, especially around annexation of Crimea. We talked about reunification of Crimea, but we tried to mirror each other's questions as much as possible so that they could be direct comparisons. But you notice that some of those slides only had Russian data and some of them only had American because it's a different context and different questions were appropriate. Yeah. Did you guys want to add anything?
I mean, we have a little bit of back and forth too on translation when we're working on it. We're, especially Stepan and I will kind of email back and forth and say like, oh, is this the right word to use? And so we do give it quite a lot of thought when we do have parallel questions to make sure that they are as close as possible.
Yeah. We didn't use open-ended for this particular study because we had budget constraints, and but another survey that will be coming out soon, we had many open-ended questions on different personalities that people recognize from each country. So that should be coming out soon, which is interesting.
Okay, and then I saw there was another hand in the back somewhere. Yeah, right there.
Thank you very much. Sebastian Vogelpohl, John Size Hopkins. I was just wondering regarding well, first of all, thank you very much for this this excellent survey, but I'm regarding the presidential election. We see very, very high numbers there, particularly in part of Democrats saying a great deal or fairly likely that there was Russian involvement in the 2016 election. I'm wondering how much did the Mueller investigation factor into that very high amount, and do we think it might change, therefore, now that the Mueller investigation is coming to complete conclusion? Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard to say how much that would have affected it, but certainly those people who follow news about U.S. Russia relations probably had hopes that there would be a more solid outcome from that. But yeah, we'll have to see how it has changed things. Although the Mueller report did pretty much endorse what the intelligence community's findings were on it. At least, again, I only know the few summary points from Barr's office that came out. So we'll have to see if there has been any impact. But I think, yeah, that will be very interesting to see. Actually, we did see over time that there was a little bit of an increase from 61%, I think, to 66% saying that Russia interfered in between the two. So there was a little bit that's before the recent highlights have come out.
But it was around the same time that Mueller was indicting Russian nationals. I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing about how it's been reported on in the U.S. or talked about in the U.S. is that the Mueller report did find that there was Russian involvement in the election. It just happened earlier than this most recent report.
Okay, we are out of time, so I want to thank you all for joining us. If you haven't done so yet, please take a copy of the report from the back of the room, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists. Okay.